Recall March of 1888. The onset of spring had already graced America's major metropolitan areas. Trees were budding, and windows, long sealed, were finally being flung open. In New York, residents strolled the streets unburdened by heavy outerwear. Boston and Philadelphia likewise considered winter a bygone season, its icy grip seemingly relinquished. A gentle ode to spring, depicting winter's quiet retreat, was dispatched to newspapers. It saw publication on the very morning that everything irrevocably shifted, for while America was reveling in winter's perceived end, winter itself was far from finished with the nation. What followed was not merely a storm. It felt like an outright betrayal. First, rain began to fall. Then the temperature plummeted, and within mere hours the rain transformed into snow so dense it obliterated streets, entombed trains, and isolated entire cities in their tracks. There were no meaningful advisories, no calls to remain indoors, nothing that truly foreshadowed the impending calamity until it was much too late. People departed for work anticipating an ordinary Monday. Many would never reach their homes again. This was not solely snow, nor merely wind, nor just cold. It was the confluence of all three, crashing against a nation convinced that spring had already prevailed. Cities descended into silence. Communication networks ceased to function. Modern life crumbled in a manner America had never before witnessed. They would later refer to it as the Great White Hurricane. And once it had passed, the essence of American urban centers would be forever altered. This is the narrative of the Great Blizzard of 1888, the tempest that arrived after winter was believed to have concluded, and the storm that permanently reshaped America. The cities along America's eastern seaboard in 1888 believed they had mastered nature. New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Washington. These were not the muddy, precarious settlements of half a century prior. They were sophisticated metropolises, electrified, interlinked by telegraph, serviced by elevated trains maintaining precise schedules, warmed by gas, and illuminated by Edison's incandescent lamps. The wires enabling this contemporary existence crisscrossed everywhere above the thoroughfares, spanning avenues, stretching from structure to structure, pole to pole, forming a dense network that conveyed electricity and telegraphic impulses. The railway lines also ran above street level, with elevated tracks lifting commuters above the horse-drawn traffic and mire, whisking them rapidly between their residences and workplaces. It epitomized progress. It was civilization. It represented the future, visibly suspended for all to behold. Everything that rendered these cities modern, everything that imparted a sense of advancement, security, and civility, hung precariously above the ground, exposed and vulnerable to whatever descended from the heavens. No one contemplated this in early March 1888. That winter had been the mildest in nearly 2 decades. By the first week of March, coastal temperatures had risen above 50 degrees. In New York, parks swelled with individuals relishing the warmth. Retailers had already begun showcasing spring merchandise. Heavy coats had been stowed away. The advent of spring felt so palpable that even the nation's most renowned poet was convinced. Walt Whitman, 78 years old that March, residing across the river in New Jersey, remained an active writer and publisher. On March 10th, he submitted a poem to the New York Herald, a simple yet beautiful piece about spring's first dandelion. Simple and fresh and fair from winter's close emerging, he penned, as if no artificial fashion, business, politics had ever been forth from its sunny nook of sheltered grass. Innocent, golden, calm as the dawn, the spring's first dandelion shows its trustful face. The poem appeared in print on March 12th. By then, its timing was laughably inappropriate. The Great Blizzard struck on March 11th. It began with rain. That Sunday evening, a light drizzle commenced across the eastern seaboard. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing alarming. The Weather Service, then operating under the purview of the Army Signal Corps, had forecasted light rain for the subsequent day. They were aware of a winter storm advancing from the west. They knew warm, moist air was pushing northward from the Gulf. However, they believed both systems would dissipate before reaching the coast. They were mistaken. Sometime during the night, Arctic air collided with the warm, moisture-laden air from the south. The temperature didn't merely drop. It plummeted. And the falling rain transformed into snow. Not a gentle flurry, not the serene, picturesque snowfall of greeting cards. This was snow propelled by winds that would later be measured at approximately 70 miles per hour. Snow that descended so thickly and swiftly it obliterated the visible world. Snow that accumulated into walls and mountains, burying everything in its path. And the inhabitants of America's grand cities awoke on Monday morning utterly oblivious to what had transpired. Because there were no warnings, no radio alerts, no television broadcasts, no emergency notifications on phones that would not exist for another century. The Weather Service had predicted light rain. That was the extent of everyone's knowledge. So, when people awoke on Monday, March 12th, they proceeded as usual. They dressed, they ate breakfast, they departed for work. The streets appeared strange. The snow was already deep and continued to fall heavily. The wind was brutal. But this was America. This was the modern era. Surely the trains would operate. Surely the city would function. Surely everything would be fine. Thousands of individuals embarked for work that morning. Many of them would never arrive. The elevated trains were the first to falter. In New York, the trains that traveled above the streets were the city's pride. They transported hundreds of thousands of people daily, efficiently, reliably, and punctually. They embodied visible progress, iron and steam conquering the chaos of street-level traffic. But the elevated trains relied on one crucial element: traction. The small engines that pulled the cars needed to grip the rails. And on the morning of March 12th, the rails were encased in ice. The trains attempted to run. They managed a few blocks, sometimes a few stations. Then the wheels began to spin powerlessly. The engines couldn't find purchase. One by one, the trains ground to a standstill. But that wasn't the worst of it. The stopped trains became impediments for the trains behind them. And in the blinding snow, with visibility almost nil, the still-moving trains could not discern those that had ceased. Collisions ensued. Not dramatic, high-speed smash-ups, but slow, grinding impacts as trains unable to stop met trains unable to move. The elevated system, which had seemed so contemporary, so dependable, became a chain of stranded carriages suspended above the streets. Thousands of passengers were trapped. They sat in the cars as the temperature plummeted. The heating systems, rudimentary as they were, could not contend with the intense cold. Windows frosted over. Doors were blocked by snow that had drifted onto the elevated platforms, and there was no way to descend. The stations were inaccessible. The staircases were buried. The trains hung above the streets like cages, and the occupants had no choice but to wait. Some waited for hours. Resourceful New Yorkers recognized an opportunity in the crisis. They located long ladders and propped them against the elevated structures. For a modest fee, they would assist passengers in climbing down to the street below. It was entrepreneurship born of desperation. But for many beleaguered commuters, it offered the only escape. Those who reached the street found themselves in a transformed world. The familiar cityscape had vanished. Streets that had once teemed with horse traffic and pedestrians were now submerged beneath drifts that, in some areas, reached the second story of buildings. Street signs were indiscernible. Landmarks were unrecognizable. The city had become a labyrinth of white. And still, The snow continued to fall, and still the wind raged, and still people strove to make their way home. Roscoe Conkling was among them. Conkling, a former United States Senator from New York, was one of the most influential politicians of his era. He had even been a presidential candidate. At 58, he was still considered fit and robust, a man of vigor and determination. On the afternoon of March 12th, Conkling left his office in Lower Manhattan and resolved to trek the 3 miles to his residence. The trains were not running. The streetcars had halted. Walking seemed the sole recourse. It nearly claimed his life. The snow in the streets was already deep, but in Central Park, where the wind had sculpted the drifts into colossal mounds, the situation was far worse. Conkling found himself struggling through snow that reached his arms. He later described the experience as being as near giving right up and sinking down there to die as a man can do and not do it. It took him 3 hours to traverse those 3 miles. He made it home, but the ordeal had severely impacted him. Within days, he developed pneumonia. 6 days after the storm, Roscoe Conkling was dead. He was likely the most renowned casualty of the Great Blizzard, but he was far from the only one. The newspapers, which resumed publication after the storm, carried countless accounts of those who had been lost. The Philadelphia Times reported that, while an officer was on his beat during the height of the storm, information was given him that the dead body of a woman had been found in a snowdrift just across the Delaware County line. It was supposed to be the body of a woman in the habit of gathering fern and mint leaves during the summer months. From the appearance of the body, the presumption is that she was frozen to death. George Chrisman, a signalman at a tower near Saratoga, was struck by a train. He had just been relieved from duty and was on his way home. The wind was blowing a gale, and he was blinded by the snow. A young boy named Joseph Brown was clearing the pavement when a pine tree, weighed down by frozen snow, fell and struck him on the head. Harry Dreers, a railroad brakeman, was standing atop a boxcar when he was blinded by the snow and collided with an overhead bridge, pitching him onto the tracks. The Boston Globe reported that Robert H. Masterson, 66, was traveling on a train that became immobilized between Mount Vernon and Williams. After several hours on board, Masterson and other passengers decided to walk toward the nearest station. He became separated from the group and collapsed in the snow, overcome by exhaustion. His body was later discovered, frozen solid. He left behind a wife and 5 children. Such accounts proliferated across the eastern seaboard. The tempest had surprised people at work, at home, on trains, and in the streets. Farmers were caught in their fields and sailors on their ships, children attempting to return home from school, and workers making their way back from factories were also engulfed. For many, aid was non-existent. There was no means to summon help, no emergency services capable of reaching them, only the snow, the wind, and the biting cold, along with the desperate hope of being found in time. The storm did not merely halt movement, it severed communication. In 1888, the telegraph served as the neurological network of modern America, connecting cities, businesses to markets, and newspapers to distant events. Information traveled at electric speeds, a marvel that had revolutionized commerce, journalism, and daily existence. However, the telegraph relied on wires suspended above the ground. As ice and snow accumulated on these wires, they sagged. When the wind arose, poles swayed, and across the eastern seaboard, lines progressively collapsed. The Baltimore Sun reported that telephone and telegraph wires and poles, weighed down by ice, were easily fractured or toppled. Trees were uprooted, and railway lines were obstructed by snowdrifts. The disruption of telegraphic communication isolated the city, causing news to be either delayed or entirely lost. New York, according to the Philadelphia Times, was as remote from Washington as it had been before the advent of electric telegraphy. For Washington itself, isolation was complete. The nation's capital had been cut off from the world for the preceding 24 hours. The Chicago Tribune offered the most striking illustration of this thorough communication breakdown. The clearest evidence of New York's absolute isolation today is the fact that telegrams from Boston to the city were received this afternoon via the Atlantic cable from England, having been dispatched under the ocean to Europe and then to New York. No other avenue of access to the city was available. Consider that for a moment. The swiftest method to transmit a message from Boston to New York, cities separated by a mere few hundred miles of American terrain, involved routing it across the Atlantic Ocean, through England, and back again. The modern world had regressed to a medieval state within hours. The downed wires represented more than just an inconvenience. They posed a hazard. Live electrical wires crisscrossed sidewalks and lay hidden in the snow. Amidst the storm's confusion, people tripped over them, and horses stepped on them. The very technology that illuminated cities became a lethal force in the streets, and assistance was out of reach. Repair crews could not get through, equipment was buried, and the storm continued its fury. The cities waited, sightless, voiceless, and alone. Shipping faced an equally devastating impact. The eastern seaboard in 1888 was teeming with vessels, passenger ships, cargo ships, fishing boats, and ferries. The harbors of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia were dense with masts, the nation's commerce flowing through these portals. When the storm hit, hundreds of vessels were either caught in open waters or struggling through perilous coastal passages. The combination of snow, wind, and a sudden temperature plunge proved catastrophic. Ships accustomed to rough seas were overwhelmed by the sheer disarray of the tempest. Visibility plummeted to zero. Navigation became impossible. Vessels ran aground on unseen shores, while others collided in the pandemonium. The Chicago Tribune reported that Alexander Bennett, John Lee, and another employee of the Singer Sewing Machine Company embarked from Elizabethport, New Jersey, in a small rowboat bound for Staten Island. Their empty boat was later discovered in the ice, considerably off course. It is presumed the men reached the Staten Island shore, but perished while traversing the meadow. Approximately 100 of the blizzard's victims were sailors. Their ships either sank or grounded. Their small boats capsized, and their bodies washed ashore for days following the storm's cessation. The maritime community had experienced storms before, but never anything of this magnitude. The abrupt onset, extreme cold, and complete failure of any rescue or communication systems rendered the great blizzard exceptionally lethal on the water. Yet, even in the midst of the catastrophe, life persisted. In New York, the Ringling Brothers Circus was scheduled to perform at Madison Square Garden on the day of the storm. Much of the city was paralyzed. Transportation was impossible. Logic dictated cancellation. Instead, the performance proceeded. The artists who had reached the venue before the storm's arrival carried on with their acts, and the audience, many of whom were people stranded in the area, seeking refuge from the blizzard, attended. They had no means of returning home and nowhere else to go. So, they watched the circus. 2 shows were staged as scheduled, forming a surreal enclave of entertainment in a city brought to its knees. Throughout the affected regions, individuals extended assistance to one another. The wind howled and snow fell. As she walked home, the snowdrifts were already waist deep. On Staten Island, an orphanage perched on a hill, the children and nuns found themselves snowbound for days as drifts climbed to the second-story windows. Their food supplies dwindled when men from a nearby town drove a team of draft horses through the snow to bring them provisions. A 12-year-old girl working in a city factory attempted to walk home. The snow was so profound that it began to accumulate on her long overcoat, weighing her down to the point where she felt she could not continue. She stepped into a doorway, and precisely at that moment, someone inside heard the muffled sound of her snow-laden coat against the door. They opened it, brought her inside, and the family cared for her until the storm subsided. These small acts of kindness, of strangers aiding strangers, of communities rallying together, unfolded across the region. While they might not have made headlines, they spelled the difference between life and death for countless individuals caught in the tempest. As the snowfall finally abated, the full extent of the disaster became apparent. The Great Blizzard of 1888 claimed approximately 400 lives along the eastern seaboard, from the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay to Canada. Estimates vary, but around 200 of these fatalities occurred in New York City alone. The Philadelphia Times reported that not only did it strike here, but it reached over Jersey, New York, and way down into Maine. Telegraph communication was almost entirely severed by midnight Sunday, yet it was learned that the blizzard extended west to Ohio and south beyond Washington. Snowfall totals fluctuated dramatically, depending on location and the caprices of the wind. Some areas received approximately 50 inches of snow. Others, mere miles away, received far less, but encountered drifts 20 or 30 feet high, where the wind had piled snow against buildings and obstructions. The storm immediately drew comparisons to a blizzard that had impacted the plains earlier that winter, claiming the lives of school children caught attempting to return home. That storm had been dubbed the Children's Blizzard. A Signal Service officer named Prender, quoted in the Philadelphia Times, offered a comparison from personal experience. "I have served 15 years in Dakota in the Signal Service Department, and I have seen some pretty bad blizzards, and I can assure you this one was a pretty bad one. This has been a genuine Dakota blizzard, and the worst you ever saw in this part of the country." The comparison to Western blizzards provoked some pointed commentary from Western newspapers. The Black Hills Weekly Journal of Rapid City, Dakota Territory could not resist subtle criticism of their eastern counterparts. While Dakota is basking in sunshine brighter than the East ever knows, New York is shivering amid the storms of winter. And yet the eastern people presume to speak of the West as a bleak, inhospitable country. They know nothing of the West. The barb was well placed. For years, the Eastern establishment had viewed the Western territories as wild, hazardous, and uncivilized. Now, the great cities of the East had been humbled by a storm the West would have endured without incident. As the clearing began, a dark humor emerged. The Chicago Tribune reported that on Broadway, sidewalks were cleared and various humorous signs were placed in the snow piles. "Keep off the grass. You can have it if you will take it away." And the familiar Central Park notice, "Do not touch a leaf or a flower." One sign made a pointed allusion to Whitman's spring poem, which had been published at such an unfortunate moment. Someone had posted what he called the Blizzard Gazette, and beneath the title were these lines: "Oh, where is the poet who wrote of the spring and the birds and the flowers and the trees? They have hustled him off to the cold, cold north and left him there to freeze." Whitman himself accepted the jest good-naturedly. His poem about spring would forever be linked with the storm that demonstrated spring had not arrived at all. The cleanup extended for days in some areas, weeks in others. The snow did not simply melt away. The extreme cold accompanying the storm kept temperatures below freezing for days afterward. The snowdrifts had to be cleared by hand, by shovel, by any available means. In many locations, the snow was simply too immense to move. The ice was left to thaw naturally, which in some places meant well into April. The trains were freed from their frozen enclosures sequentially. The power lines were restrung, and telegraph service was gradually restored, thereby re-establishing communication. However, this ordeal highlighted a disquieting truth about the contemporary cities of the East. They were susceptible. Every aspect that rendered them modern, efficient, connected, and advanced was exposed as fragile. The overhead electrical and telegraph wires, vulnerable to ice and wind, often collapsed. The efficient rail transport system, operating on elevated tracks, was easily incapacitated by adverse weather. The meticulously scheduled rhythm of modern existence relied on sophisticated infrastructure that lacked backup systems, redundancy, and contingency plans for catastrophic failures. The Great Blizzard of 1888, by any singular metric, was not the most severe snowstorm in American history. Neither the snowfall totals, the temperatures, nor the wind speeds set new records. What rendered it historic was the confluence of these elements: snow, wind, and cold, all simultaneously extreme and arriving without forewarning at the most inopportune moment, impacting cities that had believed they transcended such primitive concerns. It served as a lesson in humility, one that would not soon be forgotten. In the years following the blizzard, the cities of the eastern seaboard embarked on a profound transformation. The overhead wires, though not immediately, steadily disappeared. Over the subsequent decade, the intricate network of telegraph, telephone, and electrical lines that once crisscrossed the streets was relocated underground. The identical technology persisted, but shielded from meteorological hazards. The trains, too, descended below ground. The Great Blizzard was a significant catalyst for the development of subway systems. The prevailing logic was that if elevated trains could be halted by a single storm, then perhaps trains ought to operate where storms could not reach them. Boston inaugurated the nation's inaugural subway system in 1897, less than a decade after the blizzard, with New York following suit in 1904. The extensive underground transit networks that would characterize American urban transport were, in part, born from the memory of those stranded on the elevated lines. Emergency preparedness also underwent a significant overhaul. The Weather Service was restructured, forecasting methodologies were refined, and the concept of weather warnings, notifying the public before a storm's arrival, gained newfound importance. None of these changes occurred overnight. Progress was gradual, as it invariably is, yet the direction was unmistakable. The blizzard had revealed vulnerabilities that could no longer be overlooked. The storm also left an indelible mark on the American consciousness. For decades afterward, survivors recounted their experiences. A woman employed in a knitting mill would tell her grandchildren about the thermal underwear and waist-deep snowdrifts. A man whose great-grandfather was a railroad fireman would narrate the story of the train derailment, the trapped leg, the whiskey bottle, and the amputation performed by firelight. Families who had offered refuge to strangers caught in the storm also passed down these tales. The Great Blizzard of 1888 became a benchmark. Every subsequent snowstorm was benchmarked against it. "Do you remember '88?" became a question posed by older Americans, a means of establishing credibility and a shared memory that united all who had lived through it. A woman who was 12 during the blizzard continued to recount her story when she reached 100. The memory never dimmed, the details never faded, for it was more than just a storm. It was the moment modern America confronted its limitations. Cities had expanded so rapidly, embraced technology so eagerly, and built upward and outward with such confidence. They had strung their wires through the air and elevated their trains above the streets, believing they had surmounted the ancient challenges of distance, weather, and time. Then, a single storm, arriving at the wrong juncture, exposed the fragility of it all. This was the true lesson of the Great Blizzard of 1888. Not that snow falls, wind blows, or cold kills. Those were ancient truths, as old as humanity itself. The lesson was that progress does not eliminate vulnerability. It merely alters its manifestation. The very wires that linked cities could also plunge them into silence. The trains that transported millions could transform into aerial cages. The same modern confidence that constructed magnificent metropolises could blind those cities to unforeseen dangers. The Great Blizzard compelled America to build differently, to anticipate failure, to safeguard vital systems from the elements, and to remember that nature disregards schedules, stock exchanges, or the verses of celebrated authors. Perhaps most significantly, it instilled in people the importance of mutual aid. In the narratives passed down through generations, the blizzard itself was only one part of the story. Equally prominent were the acts of kindness, strangers offering shelter, neighbors sharing food, men driving horses through drifts to deliver provisions to stranded children, and ladder bearers assisting passengers from frozen trains. The storm showcased both the destructive and unifying power of extreme weather. But it also revealed something fundamental about the people who confronted it. They endured, they adapted, they helped one another. And afterward, they learned. This is why we continue to tell this story over a century later. Not because the snow was deep, the wind strong, or the cold bitter, but because of what it imparted regarding the cities we construct, the systems we rely on, and how we unite when everything unravels. The Great Blizzard of 1888. The storm that struck when spring should have prevailed. The storm that irrevocably altered American cities. And the storm that reminded a confident nation that winter always has the final say. If your family possesses anecdotes from the Great Blizzard of 1888, please share them in the comments section. These memories are significant. They connect us to an era most of us never knew, yet one that profoundly impacts our present. The subways we ride, the wires buried beneath our streets, the weather alerts on our phones. All of it traces back to a March morning when spring proved to be a delusion, and America discovered the consequences of believing winter was over before winter was ready to depart. Please subscribe and like the video, and if you are able, consider supporting the channel. A YouTube membership is only $5, which you can find by joining our channel. I appreciate your involvement.